Welcome, everyone. This is Penny Wyatt, the Director of Parent Programs and External Relations with the Division of Student Affairs. And I would like to welcome you to our parent webinar tonight on emergency preparedness and response with a particular focus on hurricane preparedness. So I want to go over just a few sort of housekeeping details as we always do at the beginning, just so you'll know how things will proceed. First of all, this is the volume of the webinar. So if you need to increase the volume, you can do that with the controls on your side. So, so adjust that as you need. The other thing I'd like to ask is that you use the raise your hand function that's on your side, on your controls, just to tell me that you can see the screen. Sometimes that's happened that something wasn't showing, and it was good to have feedback back from people. Okay, I see some hands raised. That's good. Okay. And then I just want to make sure, well, I guess I really don't need to ask. You would be able to hear me if you answered that question. So I know that the volume, that the sound is working. So the other thing, thank you, those of you giving me that indication. So I don't know how many of you may have participated in some of these before, but we don't mic the participants. But you do have the opportunity at the end to ask questions, and you can type those in. So we ask that you hold your questions until the end, because usually we've anticipated most of those, and we've presented some of these topics several times, so we try to incorporate last year's questions into this year's presentation. So hold your questions to the end. We'll give you kind of a cue to know when you could start typing those in, and we're happy to take those at the end. If it turns out that we can't get to all the questions in the time that we have, go ahead and write yours in, because we could answer you individually by email. So I think we'll be able to get to all the questions tonight. So the other thing I want to let you know is that tomorrow I will email everyone who registered for the webinar, whether they had a chance to join us live tonight or not. I'll send you the slides to the webinar, and if we can get the recording converted and up on the website tomorrow, I'll send you the link to that as well. But the link will eventually be on our parent program's website in the webinar archive section. So I'll remind you of that when I send you the email. So eventually you'll be able to see all those. And if you haven't taken a look at the other topics that we have scheduled, then please go to that website and look at the ones coming up for the rest of 2016-17. So I think that that's all that we need to know to get started. And so I am happy to be able to present my colleague, Norris Yarbrough, who is the Assistant Vice President for Emergency Preparedness and Response here at Tulane. And so he is going to guide you through all this good information and tell you about what we do at Tulane to keep your students safe and to be prepared for these situations, and he'll guide you to understand how you and your family and your student can get prepared for what you need to here at Tulane. So I'm going to turn things over to Norris now.
All right, good evening. Glad y'all could join us this evening. Penny and I were working out a couple of little issues here on the technical side, but we're ready to go. As Penny mentioned, the goal tonight is for me just to have a little bit of time to chat with you guys. It's a little bit like the old fireside chats that Woodrow Wilson used to do, I guess. But what I'm going to do is go through our emergency all hazards plan we have here, but the really focus tonight is going to be on hurricane preparedness. For some strange reason, that's high on everybody's minds this time of year. But we're gonna educate you guys on how we take care of your students when they're here in our as far as emergencies go. I'm going to outline for you our hurricane preparedness plan. I'm going to spend probably a little more time than usual on our evacuation plan, even though you'll hear me say this several times tonight. We haven't had to enact our evacuation plan since 2008 with Hurricane Gustav. Still, it's something that we do put a lot of planning and effort into, and it's usually a fairly frequently asked questions by our parents each year. So I'll spend a little bit of extra time on that for you. And then I'm also going to spend a little bit more time than we have in past years in helping you develop a personal safety plan, because once again, our feedback from our audiences the last couple of years show that these are two areas that they're really interested in. Okay, our approach is, as I mentioned when we started, to all hazards planning is just that. We develop our plans to allow us to be able to respond for your students to any type of emergency that may come up. The resources that we use for our hurricane response are the same resources we would use for a more local emergency, something such as a loss of water or a boiled water advisory. The same resources we would go to for supplies, water for a hurricane are the same ones that we dip into during the year if we have a loss of water pressure because of some of our older city pipes. And so that makes it easier for us. However, hurricanes are the things that really pop up on your mind. I don't know how familiar some of you folks would be, depending on where you are in the country, with hurricanes. It's something here that we have, we have two seasons each year, as one of my colleagues like to say. We have hurricane season and we have Mardi Gras. And so we're in hurricane season right now. And your hurricanes are divided up into categories depending upon the strength of the storm. I'll put that up just as an info for you. We don't pay that much attention to the category of the storm, because regardless of whether it's a 1 or 4 on up, we're going to take pretty much the same precautions. Now, our hurricane season starts June 1st and it runs through November the 30th, so we're kind of smack dab in the middle of it. Now, even though that's the calendar stretch of our hurricane season, if we look at historical data and we look at how many storms we have each year and when do we normally have them, think of a bell curve with Labor Day being the very top peak of that curve. So historically, the majority of our hurricane activity appears around the Labor Day weekend, and then we see the slope really beginning to descend on into end of September and October, all the way until the season officially ends November the 30th. So we're still approaching, haven't quite gotten to the peak of our season, and we're getting to the point where we begin to see some activity ramping up out in the Atlantic. Now, during this period, we really suggest that our students, after they get here, and you at home, stay tuned to the weather forecast. The Weather Channel is a good place to go if you're not local. That'll give you some real good fix on what the weather's doing. Our resident advisors, the RAs, in each one of the living quarters are given special training on passing information on to the students in their living quarters, and they're the ones that we'll work with if we were to have to do an evacuation. Also, our emergency updates, you can get to them online. If there's been some type of activity occurring out in the Atlantic and you're interested on whether or not the school is preparing for it, or we're concerned that it may come this way, you can go to emergency.tulane.edu. Get to our website and you'll see postings there that'll let you know what we're doing. We'll also push out information if we begin to ramp up our procedures. We'll push that out on our alert system, which is going to hit all of your students with their email and their text messages. And we'll also push out tweets if they're following us. And y'all can also follow us, and I encourage you to do so on Twitter. And our handle there is @TulaneEmergency. It's on these slides, which Penny mentioned she will be sending out to you guys. Now, understanding evacuation, this is something I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you guys about because it is a big question I get from a lot of the parents. Whenever a major hurricane is threatening our area and we're threatened with a direct impact, we're going to close and evacuate the campus. We no longer try to shelter in place. We have found that it's just much safer, much easier on the students and the parents if we just go ahead and close and evacuate the school. So it's really critical that you monitor the alert line and the Tulane emergency websites and other methods of communication that I had mentioned to you if there's some activity occurring out in the Atlantic, because that's how we're going to notify you that we've determined that we're going to have to close the school. And when responding to any evacuation order, if you're developing your plan, and I'll talk to you about this again, with your student, you want to shelter north of the city. And actually I ask that you shelter very north into the top part of our state, or a good rule of thumb is about 300 miles inland. Now, landfalling hurricanes in Louisiana that require us to close and evacuate the school are actually very rare. I know that doesn't seem the case, especially since Katrina came in 2005. Everyone thinks every year is going to be an evacuation year, but again, we haven't evacuated since 2008. So this is not an every year event. But even though they are rare, we want you and your student to be prepared, because once again, this is not something that your student or you would have time to prepare for once a storm is in the Atlantic or in the Gulf and tracking our way. Help your student develop the personal safety plan. While the plan, of course, that you're going to develop with your student should focus on hurricane preparedness, don't forget to plan for other emergencies too, especially ways that you might communicate with your students. A lot of times if something's happening in the area, I'm sure you've heard on the news, they'll talk about if it's a high profile type event, all the phone lines get jammed and get busy, and you might, especially cell phones, you might be trying to call your student and getting a lot of busy circuit sounds, and they might be getting the same thing trying to call out on you. So be sure you've established a protocol that, hey, we're going to shoot an email as a means of communication, or a text, because those will typically go through even when voice communication has stalled on you. Now, we have a kind of a handy planning tool for developing this emergency family plan, and I'm going to be taking you through that step by step. Before you sit down with your student to fill this plan out, and you will need to sit down with your student to do it, because this plan is accessed through our Gibson portal. The Gibson portal requires your student to log in with their Gibson sign-on name and their password, and that's how you'll get to this link. We do that because the information, the contact information in there is kept confidential, and we don't want just anyone to be able to get to it and look at your student's confidential contact information. We will protect it just like we do the rest of the school information. Some of the things you want to have already determined when you sit down to fill out this plan with your student is when will your student evacuate, and I'm going to be giving you some tips on when that will be as we get a little bit further into the presentation. Another thing is where they will go. Now, this is important. You want to talk with your student. You want to look at your resources. A lot of the parents will look at evacuating them home. That's usually the one we recommend, but you may not have that option. You may want to put them at a friend's or relative's house that's closer to New Orleans. And again, we'll talk to you about that as we go through. What transportation will they use? Are they going to use automobile? Are they one of the upperclassmen that have their vehicles here? Or are they going to be evacuating via airline? And then again, this is my second time to mention this, so you'll see how important it is. How are they going to communicate with you? What if you're out of the country? Again, talk about your secondary means of communication, your texts, your emails, and go past just phone calls on this. Where to evacuate to? That's a common question I get. That's probably the number one question I get when parents are working on their evacuation plans with their students. If you're bringing the student home, that's our first choice. If that is something you're not going to do because of distance, then you want to choose a location generally north of Louisiana. I caution parents and students, if you're developing your evacuation plan, don't make it Miami or don't make it Corpus Christi. You don't want to send them to the east or the west of us along the coast, because there's a good chance that they're going to have impacts from this storm also. So you want to look north of Louisiana, and a good rule of thumb is to look about 300 miles inland from the city. That is a really safe zone. That's where we look when we're talking about evacuation, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So what are some of the options you have if you're not going to be evacuating them home? Do you have any friends or relatives who could be designated as your evacuation destination? A lot of times parents will sit down and say, well, yeah, I do have a former college friend that lives in Alabama or lives in Tennessee, somewhere close that you might evacuate them to, rather than bringing them home. That's certainly your choice, but my urging here is that as you select that evacuation destination, you do keep it north of New Orleans, and if at all possible about 300 miles, because that 300 mile gives you a good buffer from the storm as it moves inland, which it's going to do. That gives you enough terrain to diffuse that storm, so it's going to be mostly a rain event as it gets further inland. All right, students have to submit this plan that we've talked to you about online. And the way you get to this is have your student sit with you and log in using their Tulane user ID, and they're going to get in their which is their email address, by the way, and then their password that they've set up. Now, when they log in with their Tulane email address, it's the part of the email address up to the @ symbol, okay, and they don't put the @ symbol in when they're logging in. Then you're going to go to, once you get logged in, you're going to go to this web page after you get logged in, and scroll down the screen and select the link that says Personal Family Storm Plan. You see that with our little friendly shadow goats there pointing towards it, third up from the bottom. And then that link is going to take you to this page. And as you can see, this is a very simple plan. All we're wanting you to do is have the basics here. I would not by any means suggest this be all of your plan, but this is the important components that you need were you to be evacuating your student. So once you get to this page, you're just going to, of course, be filling out your name and the home address for the student. Also the home phone and cell phone numbers. Cell phone numbers are important, as are email addresses. Contact information, that's the contact information for the student who we would call if we were trying to do some reaching out for them, but also for the student themselves. Cell phone and email address, the emergency contact information. And then your evacuation plan. What we're looking for here is for you to have made that decision of where they're going to evacuate to. It very well be that you're going to say home and put your home address there. Or you may be saying, Aunt Sally's and be giving us that address. Now that's when we're going to want the physical address of the aunt that they're going to, or other friend. We've also noticed that a lot of times our students, after they've been here a semester or two, will make friends with fellow students that have the ability to evacuate by car, or the ability to evacuate within the area that we're talking about, and they may decide that they're going to go with them, and that's perfectly fine. We would ask that if you change your evacuation during the year, the destination, that you go in and you update this online. You can get into this, or your student can at any time, and up-to-date the information for us. The transportation method, that's important for your student and for us, whether they're going by private vehicle or by plane. If they're putting plane, that gives us an idea of the volume of students that will be getting to the airport, and I'll talk to you about that also in a moment. And then again, we're asking for an emergency contact number here as far as a telephone number. And this may be different from the number you had up on your regular emergency contact information. I would suggest it be the emergency number of the person where they're evacuating to. And then, have you established evacuation route, yes or no? That one is intended for these students that have cars, are going to be going out by car. That gets a little dicey, and we give them information during the year, and they're encouraged to call us to help them develop their evacuation routes, because as we get closer to the storm coming in, then the roadways, of course, get a little bit tricky to maneuver. So we want to know that they have at least 2 evacuation routes and what those are. And then once you finish that, you're fairly well done with this portion. Now, again, I encourage you not to be done with your plan. You want to do a lot more talking and thinking about what you want to do with your student in case we do have to do an evac. And then you've got 2 buttons over there. The real important one to me is the far right one that says Submit the Plan, because once you do that, that files it in the data bank that I can get to from Emergency Preparedness Response to review these plans, make sure that we're getting the proper data in there. You know, we'll look for some of the key things, like I'm going to evacuate to the coast of Florida. Well, we're going to probably contact the student and say, let's rethink that, and help them with a little evac planning there. So also, this allows this plan to flow to housing, where housing can see that they have met the qualification that all students are required to have a safety plan on file. This will satisfy that for you once you've done that. And then the all-important print plan. That's where you can print a hard copy for yourself to keep in your files. The student can keep that in theirs. And once again, if you lose that, you can go back to this site, or your student can at any time, and print a copy of that plan. How do you know when to use the plan? When is the university going to do an evacuation? Well, kind of to lead up to that, we review and revise our emergency response plans throughout the year. This is not something that we look at once a year. Because it's an all hazards plan, we're using it throughout the year, and we're looking for ways to improve it as we go through a scenario, or we go through an exercise or a tabletop, which just as an FYI, we're having a large university-wide hurricane tabletop drill next week with all of our faculty and staff members that are key players in that process. We'd like to do that during the summer when the students aren't here, so that we can get all of our faculty in and sit them in a room and rehearse with them what we need to do. So we're doing that numerous times throughout the year with smaller groups, but this is our big one with the entire university next week. These plans, as we mentioned, are rehearsed quite a bit, but we also rehearse these throughout the year with our emergency response partners in the city and the state. We're very active in the state, the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. We have a seat on that function, and we drill with them throughout the year on all types of hazards. We drill with them on the hurricanes. We drill with them on active shooter drills. We drill with them on emergency response for fire, things like that. So multiple times throughout the year, we're not just drilling our staff or our students, we're working with our emergency response partners that we would depend on to respond here if we were to have some type of large emergency. Now we get daily, I get a report from 3 different weather services, including the National Weather Service, and then we have our own contract meteorologist from AccuWeather. I get summaries from them not only of tropical forecast and activity, but of the daily weather that we're going to have. Like right now, we're in a period where we get some pretty good afternoon thunderstorms with lightning, and so we're getting information from them every day, not just during storm season. But when we get into this year, this part of the year, if we have any activity going, then those meetings will bump up, and we will have several times a day, depending on how close the storm is getting. So we're going to know the moral of that story, and why I kind of went through that a little bit in detail, is that we will know well in advance that a storm is approaching. As an emergency management professional, I would much rather deal with hurricanes than some of the other events that plague other parts of the country more than us, such as tornadoes and things like that. I certainly would hate to be dealing with earthquakes. You know, these things that you don't see coming until they begin. With a hurricane, I don't have to worry that I'm going to go to bed tonight and wake up in the morning and find a hurricane landing on our shore. Okay, we see that coming, and we have a lot of time to react to it. So the moral of the story is that we will know well in advance that a storm is approaching, which means you're going to know well in advance. So what I've done is put a few excerpts in here from an operating grid we use, which is our timeline. Now, even though I've condensed this to the parts that I think are really interesting to you and that will be of interest to you, this timeline goes out further than this and has a lot more detail in it. And our timeline, which tells us what to do when a storm's coming at different levels, is tied to the city and the state's timeline. We practice these together so that we know if we're implementing a certain part of our plan, that the city's fixing to do the same thing with their plan, and that the state is putting resources in place to assist that particular part of the plan. And a good part of that is evacuation. If we're going to call an evacuation, we know the city's going to be doing that. They're preparing the roads and transportation, and the state is getting ready to enact traffic control measures to get it out. So this is all kind of there's a method to the madness, even though you may not think that when the hurricane is out there batting around. So anyway, about 7 days before landfall, we're going to be monitoring the storm. We've seen it developing prior to that on the daily tropical weather forecasts that I'm going over with the meteorologist each morning. So we've been watching it since it came off of the coast of Africa, which is where this time of year we see a lot of the activity coming, or if it's come up through the Bay of Campeche or down towards Cuba in that direction. Wherever it's coming from, we've been watching it since it was a disturbance, and then it'll move through its progression of strengthening. About 7 days is when it's beginning to get the characteristics, 7 days before landfall, that we're really keeping our eye on. And we're really beginning to track where the Weather Service thinks it's going to go. Now, as we move into the 6-day window, now we're 6 days out before this particular storm is forecast to fall on our area, and that's what the 7 and 6 days mean. When I talk about 7 days, that means were it to become a storm and continue tracking as it is, we would see the first tropical storm force winds on our coast 7 days from that point. So it's 7 days away from landfalling in Louisiana. Now it's 6 days before predicted landfall. We're going to continue our discussions with the National Weather Service. We're having a little more robust discussions with the city and the state emergency preparedness partners, and we're beginning to share some of our storm intel back and forth. We're also making sure that faculty, staff, and students' awareness is up. We're shooting out some emails here, making sure that they know to monitor the different weather sites we have for them on the university webpage. And we're getting them ready to start thinking about the possibility that this storm could come our way. All right, now when we get into the 5-day area, if we've got into an area where they're predicting landfall in Louisiana within 5 days, then our thinking is pretty well locked in that we're going to have some sort of effects from this storm. And at this point, we're trying to determine with the weather experts exactly where the bad part of the storm is going to go. Is it going to be far enough to our east or to our west that it's going to be a rain and wind event for us and nothing more, or is it going to be tracking more to us? The 5-day mark is where they really begin to get a little bit better at predicting that for us. They're still not quite there, but they're really tightening that, what we call the cone of uncertainty, and track it better. So projections on the storm path are becoming more reliable for us. We're going to again update the information to our students. We're going to now push them out on some of our emergency messaging at 5 days. That's where we're going to pop that text alert to them. We're also going to send them the emergency emails, and we'll be putting it out on our Twitter site, and then of course it's listed on our websites, both the universities and the Emergency Preparedness website. If you have signed up for parental notifications, you'll be getting these messages at this point too. So it's about the 5-day point, 5 days before landfall is the answer to your question. You know, when are you going to be aware that there's a good chance that we might be closing and evacuating the school? Now, when are we going to be able to narrow that down and give you an even better idea? That's going to be somewhere around day 4. And I've given us a little bit of wiggle room here to saying that between day 4 and day 3 before predicted landfall, the decision is going to be made to evacuate the school. Now, the reason I can't tell you firmly whether that will be on day 4 versus day 3, it really depends on the speed of the storm, how well it has behaved as far as the track forecasts that National Weather Service has gotten. But in our target goal is to let the students and you guys know at day 4, school's closing, evacuating, implement your plan at this point. The closure information is pushed out to, again, all our faculty, staff, students via the email, website, social media. The same information pushing material that I talked to you in day 5 is being used here with either day 4 or day 3. So at this point, you know that we are going to be closing the school. Transportation initiates shuttles to the airport. This is where I mentioned a while back in your personal plan, if you're putting that you're using the airport as your evacuation method, we've gotten an idea of the volume of students we've got to get to the airport. And what we start doing here, as soon as we determine we're going to close the school, we start running a routine shuttle. The students know where the shuttle will be picking up. It will take them to the airport and drop them off. Now, I'll talk to you about what they have to take with them in just a moment. But this transportation will be continuous to the airport until we have the university evacuated and shut down. Now, housing and student affairs at this point begin working with the students in there, helping them initiate the personal evacuation plans, making sure they know where to catch the shuttles to get on, helping push information to them, additional information, and helping them work through any problems they may have in implementing their personal evacuation plan, including linking them up with us if they need help from us, from the emergency prep and department, or from TUPD, the police department, or from student affairs. All of our resources there available to help the student implement their evacuation plan. Now we've moved into the 2.5 to 2 days before predicted landfall. We're continuing the school evacuation and closures. We're looking by the end of this period, as soon as we're ending up about halfway through day 2, we're looking for all of our evacuations to be complete, and we're beginning to lock down the school. The student evacuation should be complete by the end of this second day. Students that have not been able to evacuate, and I promise you I'd kind of come to the school's evacuation plan. Even though the primary method of evacuation is self-evacuation, we want the students to get back to you guys or to a known safe harbor. But we also realize that Murphy's Law will kick in. There'll be some students who have developed a self-evacuation plan, and for some reason they cannot implement it. Whatever that may be, we will not leave the students here. No one is allowed to stay on campus during a storm other than your emergency response personnel. It's locked down. The city is closed to any type of incoming traffic. And we will take any students who are unable to self-evacuate, and we're going to place them on motor coaches and take them to the University of Alabama in Birmingham. That's our emergency fallback evacuation point. We have MOUs with UAB or memos of understanding that they will receive our students. We send our student advance team ahead of that. At day 4, when you heard me talking about we've decided to close, as soon as we hit that point, we're sending our advance team to UAB. They're there working with UAB Student Affairs, getting the gym ready where the students will be housed that we have to bring in. They're there getting the meal service plans and all that worked out so that when the students arrive that had to evacuate there, they're ready to receive them. We also send our police department with them. In other words, we just changed their location. They are still a student of the Tulane University system, and they're in our care and under our charge while they're at UAB. Now, the thing is, they're going to be sleeping on a very hard gym floor. It's not going to be a comfortable time at all. That's one of the reasons we really insist that they have their own evacuation plan. But we do want you guys to know they're not going to be left here if that plan falls apart or for any reason they cannot self-evacuate. We got you 6. We're going to take care of them for you. Help your student prepare here. If the students have to evacuate, we recommend that they have a go bag ready. In fact, we have go bags available that we can give your students. They're empty. They have to fill them up, and you'll see why in just a minute. We pass these out at orientation, and we have them in our division that we can push to any students that want them. But in these bags, we ask that they take their IDs. They're going to need some travel cash. Also, their credit cards. They want to put their laptops and other valuable items in these bags. You do not want them leaving cash or credit cards in the room, okay, or any personal information. Encourage them, any information that has their social security number, things like that. Even though we'll be locking those buildings down until UPD does stay here with us, the police department, I really encourage you to have the students take all their personal identification material with them. We also ask that in that bag they've already filled out an index card with some personal contact information on there, your number, Aunt Sally's number in Tennessee, other numbers that they may need that were their cell phone battery to go dead, or they drop it, or it quits working, or they lose it. Those are numbers that since they pull them up in their contact list, they may not have them memorized, and it's a good thing to have them written on that card in that bag. We also recommend chargers for cell phones be in the bag, and their other portable electronic device. I would also recommend that you invest in a very inexpensive, they $20-25 at the most. You can get these emergency battery rechargers for your cell phones. In fact, they sell them in the technology store here at LBC. It's about the size of a little pen light. In fact, it doubles as a pen light, but it will accept the charging cords for your phones and pads, and they can put a quick charge on them if the battery were to go dead. So I would recommend you have some device like that in that kit also. Now, if they're flying versus driving out in a car, they need to print that boarding pass and put that in that bag for 2 reasons. One, the airport, when the evacuations are occurring, goes into its extra security procedures, and in those procedures they will not allow anyone into the terminal that does not have a boarding pass, plane ticket, and a photo ID. So as your student gets to the airport, they're going to have to show this to security just to get into the terminal before they even get to the TSA lines to check in. So they have to print that out and have that with them before leaving here. I talked about this, I think, pretty good, where we talked about protecting your students' important papers and having them in that go bag so they can take them with them, protecting their property, their laptops, items like that. Again, you just don't want leave those in the housing units. Protect your peace of mind by taking a couple of hours in the next week or so to develop this personal plan. Sit down with the student, talk to them, get yourself comfortable with what they're going to be doing, because when you're talking to this student, when the emergency is beginning to occur, the storm is getting close, the calmer you are and the calmness that you project to your student goes a long way in how stressed out they are and how calm they will be as they're having to enact their part of this evacuation plan. So you really want to get comfortable with this. And I recommend that several times a semester, when you're talking to the student, you just talk through your plan. Say, hey, let's take a minute and talk about what you do if you're going to have to evacuate. And that will just help you both develop a good sense of security and calmness when dealing with the hurricane. I know that these can be scary things for you guys. It's certainly not something we look forward to here, but it's something that we know how to deal with. And if you follow these steps that we're going through, you'll be a lot more comfortable if we have to enact them. Now, in the event that we do decide to evacuate, be familiar with our entire hurricane plan, and you can get to that by going onto the TU webpage and just searching for hurricane, or you can go to my website at tulane.edu, emergency preparedness, and hit the hurricane link there. Again, we've mentioned self-evacuation as the primary methods for students to evacuate, and have that go bag ready to go. A lot of folks will tell me, well, I don't want to have cash in there all year long, and that's a good idea not to. But when we first start watching that storm around 7 days and letting the students and everyone know, hey, there's something out there we're looking at, that's the time to get this stuff together. So when we get to day 4 and say, on your mark, get set, go, they grab the go bag, hence it's got that really tricky name there, and they take that with them. They're ready to go, and they're not panic stricken trying to pull all this stuff together at that point. And as I mentioned, we're going to provide the transportation to the airport if that's the way they're going. Your students should check with their RA when they get here for more information, because we are able to give the RAs more intense training in helping students get ready if we were to have to evacuate, and then they help us implement that evacuation plan. Now, please note that students will not be allowed to remain on Tulane University's property or into Tulane University's health systems buildings. They are not rated as storm shelters. We do not allow anyone to remain here, even our faculty and staff. Everyone is required to evacuate if we call for an evacuation. The City of New Orleans initiates its plan. Students have to be aware that once the city enacts its mandatory evacuation, they commandeer trains and buses. That's why you have not heard me talk about a train or a bus as an evacuation source, because the city will commandeer these to get the special needs population out of town. So that's why you're really limited to either automobile for evacuation of your student or airlines. And I've already talked to you that Louis Armstrong International is going to require that airline ticket or itinerary to access the terminal to get into the concourse. It's strongly recommended that you guys do this now. This is about the 3rd time I've said this, but it's really a lot more comfortable for you if you do the planning now than trying to put this plan together when all of a sudden we're talking about something being 7 days out and you're getting a little nervous. So take some time to do this now, and it really will make you feel better if we have such an event. One of the tricks I recommend is think about when we start talking about day 8 or so or 7, and we're saying, hey, or you're looking at the Weather Channel and you see that New Orleans is in the cone of uncertainty in the forecast map, that might be a good time to go ahead and purchase an airline ticket purchase that extra ticket insurance or airline insurance, so that if you end up not using the ticket, you haven't lost anything but that insurance money. The little graphic you see to the right are for those of you that haven't experienced storms before. And when I talk about the cone of uncertainty, that's that light shaded area to either side of the pencil line and the dots going through the middle, which represents the path of the eye of the storm. Because they can't precisely tell exactly where a storm is going to go until it really gets close, they have that cone of error. And what that cone of uncertainty or cone of error, each meteorologist is going to call it something else, that's where that track of that storm could go in either direction that way. That's why if you see that we're in it at around day 7, that's when I would say reach out there and grab that airline ticket and buy it with flight insurance, and that just takes one more thing off your worry list as you go forward. If your student will leave by vehicle, here's a couple of tips if you haven't been in an evacuation before where the rest of the city's evacuating. And by the way, I do want to back up and point out that one of the other reasons we'll pull the trigger and let you guys know that we're going to evacuate somewhere around day 4 is that keeps us a little bit ahead of the city calling their mandatory evacuation. Remember how I said we meet with our city partners when the storms are coming? We have a pretty good idea ahead of time when they're going to call a mandatory evacuation, and we're going to jump the gun a little bit here and call ours first. That gives students time to get out before the rest of the population gets out on the street. Gives you a little bit edge in getting those airline tickets. It doesn't, even though the airlines will bring in additional flights, they ramp up for the evacuation and will fly as long as they can depending on the wind speeds. We're going to jump ahead with our evacuation notification to you guys ahead of the city so that you stay ahead of that curve. But one of the things that happens even before the city calls their evacuation is that the population here is anticipating that, and everyone is buying gas. And so gas might get to be in a short supply and the lines might get kind of long. So the bottom line is we do not want your student to wait to gas up their car until they're headed out of town on the evac. That won't work. Again, once we begin talking about, hey, something's going on here around day 7 or day 8, top off your tank then. In fact, the rule of thumb that my wife and both my daughters have is that between June the 1st and November 30th, the halfway point on their gas gauge is empty. They never can get their car below half a tank. They have to go and top it off. So that might be a rule you want to talk to if your student has a car here. Have cash on hand. Remember, I talked about that. Again, I'm not advocating that they keep a large stash of cash in their living quarters all year long. But when we get to within that 7-day period, that's the time they want to go ahead and get that extra cash, and then just be prudent with keep safeguarding it. Print out evacuation routes. We have a site here we recommend they can go to, or they can call us and we'll give them recommended evacuation routes. We can give them additional information, and we do that throughout the year anyway. Now, if your student is going to fly out, we'll do the transportation again. We'll run those shuttles for them to the airport. Now, here's the thing to remember. We will not be getting them back to the school, so that once we've given the repopulate order, and we've put out, and by the way, that's the way we're going to let you know that it's time to come back to school, is through the same methods of communication we gave you the evacuate order from. You know, we're going to post it on our website. We're going to push it out through our emergency mass messaging system. We're going to use social media. So we're going to say, okay, we anticipate the school reopening and classes resuming on day X. And we will give you plenty of time for your student to travel back. We're not going to say, surprise, school opens tomorrow, and if they're not there, they're going to miss a test. That's not the way that game works, because it's just that we'll give you plenty of travel time. The other thing is, you know, most of our faculty and staff have evacuated too, so we've got to get them back in. So you'll have plenty of notice to get your student back in. But one of the things is that we will not be running shuttles from the airport to get them back in. Transportation will be on their own to do that. Last resort evacuation. In the event of evacuation, Again, self-evacuate. Tulane will evacuate any student who has been unable to self-evacuate to the University of Alabama in Birmingham. Students must register with their resident advisor if they're going to go to Birmingham. As they see that their plan has fallen apart, we're pushing out the evac information. They say, it's not going to work. I can't get out. Then they go to the resident advisor. They say, I'm going to have to go to Birmingham with the evac there. Resident advisor will shoot their name over to the personnel that'll be putting that trip together. That'll be helping us to see how many motor coaches we have to bring in, and they'll tell the student when and where to show up to get on the shuttle to go to Birmingham and what to take with them, because they'll need to be taking about 3 days of clothes with them. We don't advise they take a lot of cash if they're on the emergency evac with us in Birmingham. We'll be supplying their food there, but it's not real good food. It's UAB food, because we don't want you to stay there. We want you coming back here. And remember, this is only the last resort. Accommodations are going to be bare essentials, and they're going to be sleeping on a gym floor. Here again is some of the communication information as we wind this thing down. Our emergency website, which has all the information I've just gone over for you, as well as contact information. How can you get to me to ask questions if you need some personal questions asked? Emergency messaging system is the communication method we'll use with email, text, external sirens, and alert us. And again, really popular with our students is the Twitter. And I would encourage you guys to open up a free Twitter account if you don't have it, because you'll be getting the same information your student is. And then, of course, our web page that's listed for you there, you can get to that and get all the information. I've talked about this, practice. A couple of times a semester when you're talking to your student, just take a few minutes to rehearse and discuss your evacuation plan. So if you ever have to use it, it's kind of second nature for you. Here's some resources real quick that you can get to. And again, you don't have to write these down because Penny's going to be pushing these slides out to you. But the state has a really great resource for you there, along with some apps that you can put on your phone to help you get to some good emergency resource material. And that moves us to the question part. So we're going to open it back up to you guys to see if y'all have any questions.
Okay, so give us just a second to get to those questions. So, and some of these questions may have come in before Norris got to some of these points, but we'll just reiterate those really quickly. So, if the student does not have a car, how do they evacuate? And so, again, that, depending on how far away you are, whether you're going to plan to use, to fly them out or have them go with a friend, or if they absolutely can't find any other way to leave town, then they can use our plan to go to the University of Alabama at Birmingham. The other thing I know that may be kind of hard to think about right now because your student hasn't started here yet. I would assume most of the parents tuning in tonight are parents of first-year students. But, by the time, if this happened, then at that point your student might have friends with whom they would evacuate. So it's another thing to even think about if you're kind of close enough to come get your student, if you can take somebody else with them, or as they're making friends, they may just, as they start talking to each other, if this is imminent, then some of them will pair up, and go in groups. So keep that in mind as well. But that will emerge later once your student knows more people. For now, you need to kind of make your plan based on needing to get your student out, on their own. So another question is, are shuttles available for off-campus housing students? If a student has a car and is evacuating by plane, is there any recommendation of where to put their car? So you want to answer that?
Yeah, we run, the shuttles that I mentioned to you are open to any of the students with their student ID. So even if they're not housed on campus, if they're renting an apartment or something like that, then we would recommend that they, or we suggest that they come here and catch the shuttle. we can give them the information of where the shuttles would be boarding. In fact, we'll push that out anyway when we announce that we're going to close and evacuate. Part of that announcement will be where the shuttles for the airport will be going to. As far as the parking of their car, that's going to be on their own. We don't have space here at the university. That's one of the reasons that we discourage having cars here for our freshmen and sophomores that are not allowed to have them. So the best thing that they would do if they're evacuating without their car would be to leave it in the driveway of the apartment that they're renting. You may want to think, if they have a car, about whether or not flying is the way you want them to evacuate. Do they want to use that vehicle so that you're getting it out of harm's way?
And I can say from experience that years ago when we did have to evacuate, the public safety officers and the people in charge of parking may not let people just leave their cars in the parking garage here. And so that even, happened for those of us who work here, because they had to have essential personnel stay and they had to have places for them to park. And they were trying to get people kind of off of the surface level parking, just because even if it's just high winds and stuff, there could be debris flying around or tree limbs falling, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say if your student does have a car, then have them put themselves in that car and get it out of the city. So the next question is, if you buy a refundable ticket on day 7 before landfall, should the date to leave be the 5th day to landfall date?
That is probably cutting it a little close. If you're buying it at 7, I would have it at day 4 before landfall. That's your optimum.
And I think that you can anticipate that if we get to that close, there's going to be a lot of information that's being pushed out too. So these are very general kind of recommendations and guidelines. But we just want you to kind of know that, to be prepared and know what to anticipate. But if this were happening, we would have a lot more specific kind of information about when a decision will be made or how things are kind of coming together to kind of help you in that guideline. But I think that Norris's recommendation to get a flight and get the insurance is a great one, because then if you didn't have to use it or you have to rebook it, then you're just out that initial cost of the insurance.
Yeah, and the reason I recommend you go to day 4 instead of day 5, if you remember in the earlier slide, I told you we would be making the firm decision hopefully at day 4, no later than day 3. So I think you're just a lot better off if you wait till that day 4 mark.
So the next question is, if a student is off campus, can they still go to the University of Alabama, and who do they speak to since they don't have a resident advisor? So those students would just connect with the Division of Student Affairs, and our office is in the basement of the LBC. So they could either contact TUPD to get that information or just contact the Vice President's Office for Student Affairs. It's our division that helps implement the whole evacuation to UAB. The next question is, do students ever get stuck at the airport due to canceled flights? And I don't remember hearing any of that the last time we had an evacuation, but it's one of those things that we can't really predict. I think the main thing is that if you're leaving early enough, like we recommend, and especially if you've got all your information with you, you've already got your printed boarding pass and all of that, then you're just more likely to be in that window of time when it's safer to get out.
Yeah, let me answer that 2 ways that I think one will make you not so comfortable and the other will make you very comfortable. I have been on many business trips where I got stuck in the airport for canceled flights and there were no storms anywhere. So I'm not going to tell you they're not going to get stuck there. What I am going to tell you is we're not going to leave them there. If we have students who have, for one reason or another, missed flights at the airport, they let us know that, you let us know that they're there at the airport. We're going to get them on one of our shuttles and get them back here then if they can't get an alternate flight, and they'll be packed up with our group going to UAB. They will not be left at the airport.
Yeah, that's a very good point. They just need to make sure they've got all those contact numbers for Tulane and keep in touch with us if they're having a problem. The other thing that I can tell you that I'm not sure that Norris mentioned is that when we go into this mode, we will also enact we'll have a call center, and that number will be published on all of those emergency pages on the website. And I'm part of the staff who helps run that call center and answer the phone. So you would have a number that you can call into to get that general information or ask specific questions. And so we set that up and run that for about the day and a half before we would close, so that you've got a place to go to for centralized information. And then those of us staff who are in the call center are constantly updated by Norris's staff and the other decision makers at the university as they enact the plan. So then the next question is the same one, that is the University of Alabama option available to students living off campus? And so yes, that is, if they have nowhere else to go. I do think that if there are those of you parents who are parents of juniors and seniors who've tuned in tonight, and even just for those of you who have younger students who may be thinking about living off campus, I do think that this is an issue for you to think about, that if they're living on campus, they've got these other kind of backup options and they're supervised by staff and they're just going to be closer to resources. When they're moving off campus, they need to start thinking about all of those things like any other citizen in New Orleans, like any other adult living on their own. And so getting prepared, especially, there's a lot of other things we didn't even talk about because we're talking about the campus kind of safety system. But if they were living off campus, they need to do what every other resident in New Orleans does. And then summertime, you start stocking up on bottled water and making sure you've got batteries and that you always keep your car gassed up and all of those kind of things. And so they need to think about that. And it's another good thing for them to be in touch with their landlord about what's expected in terms of like battening down the hatches wherever they live. Sometimes the landlord's going to take all that responsibility and they might take care of securing windows and all of those kinds of things. Or they may ask that students, the residents of the apartment, take some responsibility for that. So things like not leaving bicycles or outdoor furniture on the porch, or things that could become projectiles if the winds pick up. And so, they might be held responsible for not bringing things in and then causing damage or something. So there are just some other kind of elements about living in New Orleans, if they are going to live off campus, that they have more responsibility for. So those are just some good things to be anticipating and planning for if your student's going to live off campus. So the other question was, would you advise leaving a car at the airport? And I'm sure so many people do leave their car at the airport if they were evacuating. Yeah. And, the New Orleans airport has a multi-level garage. So, and then they have some off-site parking as well. So I'm sure it gets pretty packed, in a situation like that. But
yeah, this would be the key to that, is that they can't make that flight early. They get out as soon as we say we're closing the school. And when they take their car to the airport, have that boarding pass printed that I talked about, and that picture ID, because that's the only way they're going to get the car into that garage or one of those parking lots at that time.
Because they're not going to let just residents come park their car in the garage just to get it like above, flood level, or, out of the way of debris that might be flying or something. So it seems like that's all the questions. I'll kind of put out a last call for questions. If you still have something you want to ask, then type that in. I hope this has been helpful. If you have feedback you want to give us, you can type that in, or you can always email to me at parents@tulane.edu. That's PARENTS @tulane.edu. We appreciate getting feedback. Suggestions from parents always help us continually improve the programs and services that we offer. And if you have suggestions for other webinar topics, we're happy to entertain those as well. So please email us if you'd like. I hope you found the information helpful. I know that we hope that this never happens, but I think that it's better to be prepared and know what to anticipate in case it does. And I think that's all for tonight then. Tomorrow I will send you a PDF of the slides so you have that for reference. So thanks again, parents. We appreciate your tuning in. And do take a look at the webinar schedule for the next webinars. And I see that somebody said they'll definitely speak with their daughter who's chosen to live off campus. I think that's just really wise. And I would say if they're living off campus, then especially look at those resources that are offered that are from the state of Louisiana, because those are going to be, those are framed for people who live all over, for adults, for families, who don't have this extra measure of support and resources like the students have on campus. So it'll give some really good information.
Yeah, and if you have students who are living off campus, if you will direct them to emergency preparedness responses contact information, we have information we can give them on preparing a residence for hurricane that they could use with their apartment.
Yeah, good. So I do think that's really wise. I think that the last time we had that kind of evacuation situation, we were definitely fielding calls from students who lived off campus who just really kind of had taken for granted all of the extra resources we had on campus and just needed some guidance, about kind of how to get set. So I hope that this is helpful, and we hope you have a good evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Good night.